The windfall from the North Sea in terms of tax revenue has been considerable. I mean, it is a massive question.
I want some quick answers here.
Too often in these things, there's just no acknowledgement of trade-offs whatsoever. That's why it can feel like all of a sudden everything's broken.
The short-term nature of the Scottish Government's fiscal settlement means that it can't do that, or is that just a bit too much of a get-out clause?
I think that's too much of a get-out clause.
Right, folks, welcome back to Public Knowledge. If you, like me, have ever felt confused about how this country is run, how it works, then this is the podcast for you. Because we're on a mission to uncover the deals and relationships that are shaping the country we find ourselves in today, and for better or worse, the kind of country we could find ourselves in tomorrow. We break down the big stuff and make it make sense, one episode at a time. Now, in today's episode, we're carrying on with Professor Mairi Spowage and asking, what happened to the North Sea oil and gas money? Why do so many of our buildings, networks and services feel like they're creaking? And how does the Scottish budget actually work? Let's dive in. In terms of North Sea oil and gas revenues over the last decades, that's gone into Westminster Treasury coffers, and that actually, if you looked at it in the round, Scotland's actually much worse off than it would have been. I mean, is it possible to sort of disaggregate that? What's the situation there?
Yeah, I mean, over particularly the 80s, but also some other periods as well, more recently, the windfall from the North Sea in terms of tax revenue has been considerable, and successive UK governments have chosen to use that to basically fund day-to-day spending. Yeah, so it hasn't been kind of set aside or saved up for anything like that. And that day-to-day spending has included the spending in Scotland, and the successive block grants that have been given to Scotland. So, you know, people may say, well, to what extent has the money that's been given to Scotland over the years sort of balanced out with the revenues that have been raised from oil and gas? I don't know the answer to that question. There are lots of difficulties about going back to the 80s, particularly looking at public spending, to be honest, because of the privatisations and all that. It's very difficult. But at the end of the day...
Yeah, go on.
Well, I mean, some work was done around the independence referendum on this. Quite difficult to estimate public spending properly, going back that far, to be honest. And the other taxes that were being raised at the time. None of this stuff is particularly easy when you go back in the sort of mists of time for the sort of data we could do to estimate that. Yeah. It's quite tricky.
Because I guess the reason I asked that is just to prod at that notion that so many people maybe think that there's more spending in Scotland, and in seeing it as some kind of subsidy or handout to Scotland that's unearned in some way. It's just kind of prodding that and probing that and trying to understand that a bit better.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at every part of the UK, I mean, countries in general, there will be areas that raise more tax than spend money, and there'll be other areas that are the opposite, and that's the nature of bringing money into the centre and then spreading it out. And if you look at all of the regions of the UK, so if you split England into its component parts, the only ones that are raising more tax than they're spending on services is London and the South East, and sometimes the East of England, which is about in balance. So just like many countries, the capital city of the UK generates huge amounts of revenue compared to other areas. And then if you look at every other region, including all of the other regions of England, you know, more is spent on services than is raised in tax. And if you look at all of the regions in terms of how much is spent per head on services, you've got Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland up there with the most spent, but it does vary hugely across the different regions of England as well. You know, quite often based on things like how much is spent on transport infrastructure, because you get quite a lot of money spent in London as well, because a lot is spent on transport in London. But that's the thing, amongst the regions of the UK, you know, most of them, more is spent on services than is raised in tax revenue, if you look at any sort of particular year.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. And something else that was coming out from what you were saying when you were describing the block grant, then the tax revenues raised in Scotland that amount to what we have to spend in the Scottish public purse. When you mentioned the point about the changes made, whether policies increase spending or decrease spending in England having a corresponding impact in Scotland, it just strikes me how interlinked this stuff is. Some people might say that with greater devolution, it's become a bit more complex and a bit more interlinked and interdependent. What would you say to that?
It's a really interesting question, because you would think, these income tax powers have been devolved, so we got much more freedom to set our income tax policy, which we do, and perhaps raise more revenue. But a lot of these sort of individual powers being devolved sort of highlight weird interdependencies within the system. So, for example, the Scottish point at which you start paying higher rate in Scotland, the higher rate threshold, is different to that one in the UK. Fine, we're devolved, we've got a different one. It's about 43,000 instead of 50,000, so it's lower. You start paying higher rate at a lower rate. The point at which you go from paying the normal rate of national insurance down to the lower rate is at the UK higher rate threshold. Okay. So you've got a bit of the income distribution where you're paying the higher rate of income tax and the higher rate of NICs, which was really not supposed to be the case. Nobody thought about it, nobody really worried about it at the time. But then we've got that situation where people within that part of the income distribution have got this very high rate on the next pound that they earn. So these are some of the sort of interdependencies between the system. Other things like some of the social security powers that have been devolved. We've introduced some, like a new benefit, the Scottish Child Payment, which focuses on children in poverty. I mean, that's dependent on, the eligibility for that's dependent on a reserve benefit. So it's a question, so what if that changes, or the eligibility for that changes? Will that then change how much we have to spend on this devolved benefit? So there are all these kind of really interesting interdependencies within the UK system, which, to be honest, devolution has just kind of complicated further, and it is just such a complicated system to get your head around.
I mean, what does that mean for accountability? Because I think that's the hard part, really, as well, as someone living here, or as somebody, maybe organisations trying to look at, who to blame is probably not the right terminology, but who to go to, who to advocate to for better quality of life, a more thriving economy in Scotland, because it just feels really messy.
It is, and I think if you think about things around levers around economic growth, so attracting companies to come and set up in Scotland, perhaps competitive or sorts of tax reliefs that might incentivise investment or investment in R&D, thinking about the skills system, a lot of these things, some of them are devolved, some of them are reserved, and so there's a sort of messy interplay between the two. Quite often the powers that the Scottish Government have are on this sort of stuff are more longer term, so there's things around the skills system. They do have some powers around economic development, but really the big fiscal levers, the big economic levers are really in the hands of the UK government, so that can make it quite complicated. Even if you look at something like energy transition or policies on climate change, as you know, Sepi, these are they're really messy in terms of who's responsible, and really what they need is the two governments working hand in hand, because it's where the planning system interacts with issues around grid connection, which is, interacts around trying to get people to invest in Scotland. All of these things need all layers of government working together, and of course things around planning get even more complicated, which is a common thing that's cited by businesses as a barrier, because that's the responsibility of local government as well. So you've got these three layers of government, and all of them need to be working together really on these things, because it's not simple. The economy isn't a simple machine where you pull one lever here and something obvious is going to pop out the other end. Quite often there's unintended consequences, and things we're not expecting can happen.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, the point around Holyrood and Westminster working better together is one I make in absolutely every single interview when I'm talking about the energy transition or climate change. And I think what's interesting for me is the way that the civil society landscape or the business landscape across the UK following devolution has sort of fractured and fragmented, where many organisations might just focus on what Holyrood can do to improve a situation, and then others focus on Westminster for UK-wide. But, you know, a Scottish voice down in Westminster for the economic levers we need pulled down there to make an impact up here in Scotland is basically non-existent. That for me is one of the key points here. Basically, my objective, the objective of probably lots of people listening to this podcast, is how do we make Scotland a prosperous economy, a prosperous, thriving place to live, you know, inclusive, sustainable growth, just energy transition, high quality jobs, you know, healthy public purse. But so much of that's focused just either on Holyrood and not at all in Westminster. And I think I'm just curious to see what this new government in Westminster will do. I mean, what's your sense there in terms of their focus on helping cultivate a much more prosperous economy up here in Scotland? It's
a good question, and I guess the first welcome thing from a policy perspective is to see a clear commitment to overall strategy, which, you know, for an industrial strategy, looking at trade, having a trade strategy. Because for the last few years there's just been no strategy at all, and to be honest, particularly, I mean, we do a lot of research on trade, and you know, what was the strategy? I'm not sure. So I mean, it's good to see that there will be strategy, but there's been lots of strategies up here in Scotland too. Over the, you know, we're not short of a strategy or two being produced. And it's whether it actually drives, you know, prioritisation, which helps the government achieve the outcomes it states it wants to achieve. And too often in these things, there's just no acknowledgement of trade-offs whatsoever. There's a pretense that all of those things you said can happen all at once, you know. And sometimes we're going to have to choose things. So perhaps in order to achieve things like the energy transition, we might have to accept that we're not going to build certain things, and we might need to buy them from abroad. We might need to import them, and that might just be part of, you know, the decision we need to make in order to achieve another outcome. You know, there might be trade-offs sometimes between things like economic prosperity and, you know, the energy transition or tackling climate change. There might sometimes be trade-offs between tackling issues around child poverty, you know, and competitive. You know, these things might well have trade-offs, and I think it's the lack of acknowledgement of trade-offs which is always a problem, because if you pretend you're going to do everything, then really what you're saying is you're not prioritising anything.
And to what extent do you feel that, and actually maybe you should break this down first for the audience, you know, the way that the Scottish Government has to set its budget on a yearly basis. Can you just unpack that for the listeners? So we've talked about where the Scottish Government gets its funding, the block grant, the tax revenues. Is that done, over what time frame is that done? And then how does the Scottish Government set its budget? And does the time frame for that tie one of their hands behind their back, essentially? So
what I would say is that the last several years, I was going to say, have been unusual in that it has very much been year to year to year, you know. So there was what we call a spending review done by the UK government in 2021, but basically since the kind of Brexit time, we've been on a quite a tumultuous time for funding, and for the government knowing how much they're going to have to spend, not just next year but the year after and the year after that. So we have been through a period in the last 5 years or so, especially, of just setting next year's budget, because all the Scottish Government know is what they're going to get next year. There hasn't been that certainty of funding that's coming down the track. And because of the block grant from Westminster is the majority of the funding, not having that certainty really does sort of tie their hands. But that then filters down to all of the people that the Scottish Government fund, including local government and including all of the third sector bodies who deliver services. You know, it's filtered right through the public service sort of delivery landscape, and meant that these sort of year-to-year allocations make everything quite precarious. And although things like the core public sector have things like, you know, no compulsory redundancies and, you know, security of employment, the people who are delivering services sometimes don't have that, and particularly third sector organisations who employ people to deliver some services. So, I mean, that's the consequence that comes from only having 1 year settlements year to year to year. And so what the government have been doing is usually around December, because they get the certainty of their kind of block grant from Westminster in sort of the autumn time, they're setting their budget for the next financial year. And what is coming from the UK government, and this will be welcomed, is a spending review in the spring, which should give them the certainty of their funding envelope for the next couple of years after this year. So you're going to have a sort of more certainty of the next year and then the two after that. And the UK government have committed to doing this on a more rolling basis. So essentially every couple of years, setting another sort of 2 to 3 year spending horizon, which will just give all departments, but particularly the devolved governments, a bit more certainty about what their funding outlook might look like.
Okay, that's great. And so we've talked about the block grant, we've talked about the tax raising powers. What about borrowing? Can you just give us a bit of a history of how that came about, what the Scottish Government's powers are there, and why it's an important area to look at?
So the Scottish Government has quite limited borrowing powers. Since devolution, it's had some facility to kind of move money between years. So back before the Scotland Act 2016, I think it was called the Budget Exchange Mechanism, and essentially it allowed them to, if they weren't going to spend money in a year, there was some mechanism for movement between years, but it was quite limited. The Scotland Act 2016 created the Scotland Reserve, which gave them more flexibility to pop money away and then draw down on it, if they, like a sort of savings account, if they wanted to. But that's not borrowing, that's just putting money away and then accessing it if you want. But what the Scotland Act 2016 also introduced was the power to borrow, but for capital investment. So this is for spending on things that are going to last. So it's not something that you're sort of consuming, like, money on pay or paper clips. It's, you're building something. You're going to build a school or a bridge or a road or something, and you're going to get use of it on a continuous basis. So that was introduced at the level of £450 million per year, and is now being uprated with inflation since the Fiscal Framework Review.
Which is a tiny amount when it comes to kind of infrastructure projects.
Yeah, it's not a lot. I mean, it's small. It's relatively small. Now that's capital. They don't really have any powers for resource borrowing, so this is what we would call borrowing for day-to-day spending, except where there's been a forecast error, particularly on income tax. So they're kind of borrowing to plug that kind of difference. So they're allowed to do it in that circumstance, but it's only in that circumstance, so it's fairly limited what their resource borrowing powers are.
I mean, it's a tough one really, because capital spending is so important to build up your stock of infrastructure assets that underpin your economy. And I think trying to unpick at the moment, we know we need to upgrade so much of our infrastructure. How can we do that if we're sort of living hand to mouth year to year, when infrastructure projects take years, if not decades, to be completed?
It's hugely difficult. I mean, it really is. I mean, most of the capital funding in Scotland is coming from the capital block grant, which is around £6 billion a year. And I think we've got to take a step back, that public investment in the UK overall, and including in Scotland, is much poorer than competitors, than OECD averages. And also our business investment is poor and lower than these sorts of competitors. So both on the public sector side, we're investing less than our competitors, and on the business side, we're investing less. And what that's meant for the last 10 or 15 years is that our capital stock, so basically, the assets that we can kind of sweat to make our economy competitive and dynamic, have degraded. And I think on the public side, that's why it can feel like all of a sudden everything's broken, because it's sort of after a decade or 15 years of not maintaining, not investing, not upgrading, not thinking about, don't want to bring up ferries, but do you know what I mean? Not like looking at the pipeline and what you need to do today so that in 15 years you've got what you need. And I think that it's been a long time coming, this sort of feeling that everything's just pretty degraded and broken. And it does take a long time to therefore fix that.
And that sort of long-term thinking, though, do you think that's hampered by the current fiscal settlement that we have? Or is that a broader issue? Would it just be too easy to say, oh, well, the short-term nature of the Scottish Government's fiscal settlement means that it can't do that? Or is that just a bit too much of a get-out clause?
I think that's too much of a get-out clause, to be honest. I mean, we can see that many governments in many places don't like to make long-term decisions and instead make short-term ones. So it happens, twas ever thus, I suppose, in political cycles sometimes aren't long enough when you're thinking about investment decisions. And we see those challenges again, and to go back to sort of issues around investing in the transition or climate change, long-term decisions are really difficult for governments if they feel that they're not going to benefit from them politically in the 4 or 5 years' time. So, I mean, I'm not saying that there hasn't been some difficult situations, particularly in the last few years for the Scottish Government, in terms of trying to see what's going to happen with public sector pay deals and within the constraints they have and the limited flexibilities that they have. It does make it difficult. But we're clear, as many are, like Audit Scotland or the Scottish Fiscal Commission, that some decisions the Scottish Government have made have tied their hands even further and therefore could make a kind of difficult situation worse. So, I mean, I understand the difficulties and multi-year funding settlements will certainly help. But I think a government should be in the business of trying to make long-term decisions to achieve long-term outcomes. And people like us, I suppose, will always try to push them to be thinking about those long-term decisions, trying to move to prevention, trying to spend more on things that are going to save money in 5, 10, 15 years' time, even if they're not going to politically benefit from it in the short term.
Yeah. And so, we're coming towards the end of our time. 2 final questions. Going back to this point around, we want Scottish public finances to be on a much stronger footing. We want our economy to be on a stronger footing. What key interventions, very quickly, we're not going to set the world to rights in 2 minutes, but what would you say, what are the kind of top 1 or 2 things that we absolutely need to get right for that longer term prosperity?
Okay, yeah, I mean, it is a massive question.
I want some quick answers here.
I think that, that a move to really significant and maybe painful in the short term public service reform is really needed. We know in the long run that our public services are probably not going to be sustainable. We all know what the principles are of public service reform, or people who are in this world do. The Christie Commission in 2011 set it out very clearly. I don't think there's been meaningful movement on those principles or the things that were suggested then. So, hard decisions that we're going to have to make about, who we're sending to prison, or the effectiveness of doing so, or what are the really effective things if we're really about trying to make sure people are rehabilitated for society. These aren't easy conversations to have, but they're probably things that we need to discuss. And how are we going to both interact and pay for things like our social care system in the long run? These are things that need to be, so the nettle needs to be grasped. And I think other things which would really help are around government transparency about its budget, which I think needs to be improved hugely so we can all see what's going on and perhaps be part of the conversation.
Wow. Gosh, I feel like we've just scratched the surface, but it's an amazing start. Thank you so much, Mairi. And the absolutely final question here is, of all the things, whether we've discussed them or not, on the public finances in Scotland, what would you say must absolutely be public knowledge on this stuff?
I think really understanding what we're spending money on, that sounds like a simple thing, but it's not.
Well, this discussion's shown that it's not simple at all.
No. So we're trying to produce quite a lot of analysis and run up to the budget to help people understand this. This is how much we're spending on these things. And, as all asking the question, okay, that's how much we're spending, but what are we getting for that? Because it shouldn't just be about how much are we spending on health. It's, are we healthier? So it's really asking that question about what are we getting for those pounds that the Scottish Government are spending on our behalf.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Public Knowledge. I hope you found it valuable, and there's plenty more where that came from. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts or Spotify, follow us on social media, and do have a think about which 3 people you know who would find this episode valuable and send it to them. Help us build a critical mass of people bringing public knowledge to light, because some things should never be kept in the dark. Till next time.